Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Robert Finger, who is Professor of Agricultural Economics and Policy at ETH Zurich. His research is focused at the interface of agricultural sciences and economics. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, Jill. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I want to start with one of your papers from 2019, Economic Benefits from Plant Diversity in Intensively Managed Grasslands, in which you say grasslands cover a major share of the world's agricultural area and are important for global food security. Plant species diversity in grasslands is known to increase and stabilize biomass yields. You say we economically evaluate these effects using a rich data set from 16 intensively managed grassland sites across Europe. And so what do you find? Where are we in terms of managing grasslands?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to highlight that this work was done together with outstanding colleagues, namely Andreas Lüscher, Nina Buchmann, and in particular was led by our former PhD student, Sergei Schaub. Yeah. Well, we have been interested in grasslands. You indicated it because of their global, but also regional importance in Europe and in countries like Switzerland in particular. Yeah. And we investigated the possible role of species-rich grasslands to produce, more, better, and more stable. And that's actually quite intriguing, the idea of using nature to buffer for specific shocks. And what we... this is a concept that is well known in ecology, that more diverse grasslands are more shock resilient, so to say. So, for example, because specific varieties like plant species in a grassland can use specific niches. So, for example, one might be more vulnerable to drought stress than another. So, in the situation where a drought hit the grassland, the loss of yield in one of the plant species in that grassland is maybe compensated by more yields from another species in there. So this is a very nice idea to kind of stabilize possibly production. And what we did in that paper is to quantify the economic benefits arising from that. So we did different things. First of all, we put a price tag on the production. So we not only considered the biomass of grasslands produced, but actually looked at the quality of the grasslands as well, so that we could transform that into a quality adjusted yield measure and then put a price tag on it. And secondly, we not only looked at the average production, but also on the variability of the production. So we quantified how much the diversity of plant species in the grassland is able to reduce the variability, the variance of the production. And we brought both together and assumed that a risk-averse farmer would be willing to pay a bit more to avoid catastrophic events and high variability of his or her profits. And so this was the basis to quantify these economic effects.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Robert. You say here uh, plant diversity not only increased milk production potential yields and thus revenues, but also reduced production risks. So what's the mechanism for milk production yield increase? Is it that the livestock is healthier, better fed? What is the mechanism?
So the mechanism that we investigated is really not necessarily at the level of the animal itself, but
Yeah,
at the level of the fodder provided to the animal. So we here quantified the link between grassland yield in terms of quantity produced, but also then quality in terms of how much it actually is kind of like suitable for animal production. So how much this, for example, can be transformed into a so-called milk production potential. And the mechanism here is that we find that more species-rich grasslands provide both higher yields that are not necessarily of lower quality and more stable yields. And in the setting that we looked at is in intensively managed grasslands in Europe. So
yeah,
here we have a range of 1 to 4 species in the grassland. So it's still a few species, but what we find is that adding a few more in these intensively managed grasslands can provide benefits to the farmer.
yeah. What I was thinking about, Robert, I wondered, can we really prove that it is really plant diversity that is driving the outcome, or could there be something else?
But the nice thing was two of the co-authors on that paper, Nina Buchmann and Andreas Lüscher, are ecologists, people working in grassland science. So they provided the data that we
Yeah,
used here, and that comes from experiments. So this is the nice thing. We had access to a rich database in which these grassland experiments were conducted. So where basically there was a clear setup with different trials over several years where the performance under different plant species diversity settings were investigated. So that makes it very straightforward that we here can make these claims that under specific conditions, higher plant species diversity leads indeed to higher yields of similar quality, but with lower volatility of profits involved.
yeah. So it's unambiguously good. You have higher yields, higher revenue, lower volatility in production, lower risk of management. So if this is the case, how would one take a grassland and improve its diversity? Is there anything in the data that might tell us how one could transform or enhance diversity to reach the stage?
So maybe to clarify, what we have not explicitly spelled out in that paper is that a higher diversity might also come with higher costs. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, we now have a study that we submitted where we look at the prices of seed mixtures. So, one pathway to increase plant species diversity is simply to have a seed mixture in the very beginning that contains more than one species, and then use multiple species. And if you look at the cost side, then you see also that on average, more diversity in the seeds is associated with higher costs. So there might be some balance, some trade-off there.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, it's important to flag that in contrast to, let's say, grassland management in many other countries, in Switzerland and neighboring regions, it's not uncommon to have multiple species in the grassland. So this is something that is already used. But here we really elaborate also on the kind of extent of the effect. How much can you go on and expand the plant species diversity to gain from these benefits? Because this is also motivated by the fact that risk management at the level of the field, of the farm, of the entire agriculture sector is simply gaining importance because of climate change. We experience more frequently climatic extreme events like droughts, heat waves, and that ultimately also leads to a higher variability of agricultural production. So then there are different pathways how farmers actually can cope with increasing risk exposure. And one of them might be at the level of the field to have more rich kind of grasslands, or also in other cropping systems to increase the diversity. And then there might be other complementing approaches like insurance and so on.
Yeah. And so at the micro level, there is sort of a net present value question. You have to invest a little bit to increase the diversity. But if there are benefits to the ecological benefits, if the benefits to the environment, then those additional benefits are garnered by the entire society. So do you see some sort of government subsidy type situation that might improve overall outcomes?
So overall, indeed, as you say, there are two sides of that coin that might be promising. There could be private benefits to be exploited for the farmer, but there could be also public benefits, because more diversity often also comes with, let's say, other ecosystem services. So maybe, for example, more diversity could mean more access for pollinators to actually feed on a specific field, but you may have also a more beautiful landscape that we all appreciate. So there are different ecosystem services provided by more diverse agricultural systems, and also here very specifically by more diverse grasslands. So the role of the government could be different, or there could be different entry points for the government to support that. I guess the key is really also information and education in that sense. So I guess it really needs to be transported from fundamental research to more applied things like we do it, where we try to transform that into monetary values, and then really down to the farmer. And this is something that we did also in that project. So that type of information we obtained here really then ended up in kind of like agricultural journals and also in kind of like leaflets provided to farmers. So this is something that is really important, the information side, but there could be also targeted support for specific farming systems, in particular if you have to make bigger investments, maybe then to set up a new production system that is more diverse, then it might be really kind of an invaluable approach for the government to support some kind of transition.
Yeah, the private benefits you talk about, Robert, I would imagine it's not linear, right? So is there some sort of minimum required diversity type metric in the data that, once you get to that diversity, then the marginal effects beyond that is not high? Is there anything like that in the data?
Indeed, this is true. So this is not necessarily linear. Rather, I would say there is a saturating effect at one point, so that more plant species might not necessarily all the time have the same kind of like marginal effect on productivity and risk reduction. So this is definitely the case. But as indicated here in this paper, we really focused on an intensively managed grassland that usually has not a lot of plant species in it. So I said that was in a range of 4, but we also have other papers where we make use of experimental data that contains up to 60 species in a grassland. And this, of course, is probably not suitable for every farmer to have like 60 species in a grassland. Also, I indicated that earlier, the cost might be very high for that to establish this type of diversity in terms of cost for seed, for example, but also then maintaining it in terms of management. So here might be really a kind of like a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And I guess one of the key conclusions for us is that even in intensively managed grassland systems where you want to push the production in order to have a good feed basis for your animals, adding some diversity might be good.
Yeah. It's a scientific and economic question. It is non-linear. It's somewhat complicated to internalize. So I wondered, like you mentioned, Robert, one intervention is really providing the information to the farmer, right? Perhaps there is some sort of an optimization type thing that an external agency could provide for the farmers to execute. Do you think that is possible?
I guess it's really important to be transparent on costs and benefits associated with specific options like more plant species rich grasslands. So this is important, but also with the let's say with the uncertainties associated with it. So this is something where I think the in particular the field trials, the experiments really run also at farms are super valuable to provide information to farmers, because an important issue is always also to remove uncertainties associated with specific transitions. So whenever you have to jump into a new production system, you may know that there could be some benefits, and nevertheless, you may hesitate to make that step simply because it's too uncertain. And here, providing information about experience from field trials, but also experience from other farmers, and in particular, then enabling the exchange between actors, between farmers, is very important. That is key to promote whatever new solution is around.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about insurance in other papers, but there could also be a possibility of the government buying the downside to reduce the overall uncertainty faced by the farmer, perhaps.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, an important element. So crop insurance and also insurance for grassland systems is something that is, of course, very relevant in all agriculture settings globally. But in contrast to the US, where the agriculture insurance business is quite, let's say, well developed, in Europe there are some gaps. And for example, for grasslands, there's indeed there are some insurance solutions on the market. For example, to cover drought risk, but not a lot. So this is interesting because now, first of all, providing possibly a subsidized insurance for grasslands might involve some moral hazard for farmers. So the farmers may choose then to use a lower level of plant species diversity because the insurance is providing the buffer for them and the risk management. So, and here actually could be a nice also combination of elements that you say, well, we provide a specific insurance scheme for you, but only if specific requirements are taken at the level of the farm. And that could be that you indeed use a species-rich grasslands, which is reducing the need for the insurance actually to pay out because your production is stabilized with that natural insurance. But on the top, if something is going wrong anyway, then there is a crop insurance in place that may support you. So I guess this is something that is also a really nice opportunity for systems where crop insurance, agriculture insurance in general is not very well developed that you can build it up better in the sense of that multiple purposes are fulfilled to stabilize incomes of farmers, to incentivize food production, but also to incentivize the production in a specific way that it's environmentally sustainable, for example.
Yeah, I want to talk about insurance a little bit. You have a recent paper, Insuring Crops from Space, the potential for satellite retrieved soil moisture to reduce farmers' drought risk exposure. You say crop producers face significant and increasing drought risks. You evaluate whether insurance is based on globally and freely available satellite retrieved soil moisture data can reduce farms' financial drought risk exposure. Are these private insurance companies that are providing these products, or these are government products?
So also here I have to acknowledge that this was work done with different colleagues, in particular Martin Hirschi, Tobias Dahlhaus, Yannick Bucheli, and in particular the paper was led by Willemijn Vroege, a former PhD student in my group. Yeah, we look at the potential for satellite retrieved soil moisture to be the underlying for an index insurance scheme in crop production systems. And let's say the starting point is that we have many farms in Europe that face significant drought risk. So that means that there are frequently severe yield losses because of drought. We observe that the probability of drought occurrence, but also the magnitude of occurrence, the intensity of that effect is increasing over time, also because of climate change. And we see that there is, in the moment, there are very few options for farmers to really buy an insurance that covers their drought losses. And this is due to the fact that drought is a kind of like systemic risk. So it's very difficult to insure because, well, in the moment the drought is hitting the continent, then it's not a very local event, but in contrast, regions, countries, or even the entire continent is hit. So that means this loss adjustment to go every single farm that often cannot be provided in an efficient way. So here you need kind of other mechanism to provide insurance. And this type of index insurance, so that it's not based on the actual performance on the farm, not going to the field and assessing the damage, but using an index like soil moisture to trigger the payout is very intriguing. And these products are around in the European market, but are not flying high in the sense of that they are massively used. So the basic motivation would be that this is like a private insurance company offering these solutions. Yeah. And the goal of the paper was to show that basically satellite imagery can play a vital role in facilitating the provision of better, more efficient, cheaper drought insurance solutions. And in particular, we make the point that freely available satellite imagery data can be sufficient to provide a quite effective insurance solution. So in that sense, it's making use of data that is provided in that example here by the European Space Agency for free and can be quite, let's say, valuable for crop insurance purposes.
Yeah, I wondered, Robert, from the farmer's perspective, if they believe in case of a systemic shock, sort of countrywide or region-wide shock, the government will then step in and help them. If they believe that, then they will have less of an incentive to buy private insurance products, right?
Yeah, this is an excellent point. And indeed, that happens. Yeah, for example, 2018 was a year where many European countries were hit by a severe drought that led to sharp yield losses. So, for example, our case study in that paper is focusing on Eastern Germany, which is a very important crop production region, but it's very drought prone, and there yield losses in crops like wheat that we focus on really have been up to 20-30%, so quite significant. And in that situation, the government stepped in and provided support for farmers. And this is, of course, something that is going to be a killer for the development of a private insurance market. And as indicated, it's a bit kind of like a ground where little insurance solutions for drought are established. And now it really needs to make a step forward. And I guess whenever the government is signaling that they will provide cover for whatever loss occurs to the left and right of the insurance system, then of course it will never fly. But on the other hand, we also see that more and more European countries are also interested in providing subsidies to the insurance system. And then, of course, at that point, if you say, well, I'm going to subsidize a specific insurance, then it needs to be really very clear and also very strict in its execution, that there are no kind of like payments, no catastrophic payments provided to the farmers anymore if they are not insured. So, but I guess this is politically, it's a very difficult question, but scientifically, of course, it's either or.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was also wondering, as technologies advance, artificial intelligence techniques and other techniques, if there are more sophisticated players entering the market, there could be a diverse set of products, right? There could even be sort of forward markets if a private company can understand the risk a lot better than the farmer, that the private company could forward buy the output. And if the farmer is really trying to reduce risk, it might be a good decision from a farmer's perspective. Do you think those types of things could happen?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think, I mean, we are really moving ahead with the technological development in the agriculture sector and everything around it. And this is going to be a true game changer in that setting. So, I mean, now you tapped on different elements, but obviously, if satellite imagery is powerful in kind of like flagging where there might be a failure of specific crops in a specific region to a specific point in time, this information is obviously incorporated in kind of all the actors buying and selling in that market. So, and this is of course already used, but as you say, there's such an advancement in terms of quality in terms of temporal, but also spatial resolution of satellite imagery in terms of indicators that you can use to correlate with crop yields. And so while this is advancing, of course, the information is getting better and better. And the second element that you indicated is also that of, well, let's say, artificial intelligence and bringing all the data sources together that we have. It's not only satellite imagery, but it's also a lot of data on the ground that we actually have. And there is more and more data gained also from, let's say, precision farming applications. So if farmers are using sensors, GPS, so you exactly know what they measure at what point in the field, what inputs they apply. So you have so much information that all can flow together to do many different things. First of all, forecasting the production, but second, and I guess that's key for the farmers, to provide a basis for them to make better decisions. So give you a very specific example. If we do have a good forecast that a specific drought situation might be around because soil moisture is approaching critical levels and precipitation forecasts are also contributing to that picture, then you might make different decisions on, I don't know, what to crop, what inputs to apply, what tillage system to use. So there are many information that can be provided to the farmers to make better decisions. And this is something that is already available to some extent for farmers in farm management information systems. But I guess this is going to be more and more viable, also incorporating elements of risk and risk management. And I guess also that will imply that buying an insurance might be one of the elements that you can click on your dashboard when deciding what inputs to apply and not. So in that sense, it's going to be really a fascinating time ahead, because to flag that the empirical question of agriculture economics and the interrelation with risk and risk management was usually one where we have a lack of data. So it was always difficult to find a good time series of multiple farms and really have good yield records and correlate it with specific weather outcomes. But ultimately, we are really going in a phase where data is absolutely abundant, and we have everything we want, maybe not in the structure that we are used to have it, but there's a lot of data to be kind of used both in research but also industry applications.
Yeah, I wondered, Robert, do you see any sort of structural implications? What I'm thinking is that if you're heading in this direction, it is going to be very information heavy. It's going to be technology heavy. It becomes sort of a risk management, resource allocation, portfolio management problem. So in general, it becomes, there's going to be a lot more scale in the business. So would we move toward, farming done by a few entities in very large scale who have access and knowledge and capabilities to manage it in this fashion?
Absolutely. So I guess this is changing the role of actors, and maybe even bringing completely new actors to the field of agriculture. So I guess one element is already that agriculture machinery providers and input providers are developing and really establishing very well these kind of farm management information systems and prescription tools that really give you a clear indication of what to do. And these are entering different markets then. So that means if you are the machinery provider that actually also can use the data that is generated at the level of the farm, you can tap on much more business fields than just selling machinery, because now you have a lot of more information available. But also companies totally outside of that field may be key players in the future. For example, if you have the necessity for kind of capacities and experience in big data analysis, this might be a totally different player than entering. So I guess we will see more and more new players entering. And for example, we talked about insurance and satellite imagery. And in France, for example, there's an insurance scheme that is realized also via Airbus. So Airbus is providing here the expertise in satellite imagery. For example, Airbus is now an insurance player, so to say, in the agriculture sector, which obviously is not their core business, but they have an expertise that is relevant in there. So these type of blended elements will occur much more often.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We'll take a quick break, Robert. When we come back, we'll talk about some of your other papers, especially those related to pesticides.
Good. Okay.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back. Robert, we were talking about farming, how farming might be changing with more data available, satellite-based data, technologies like artificial intelligence, better risk management, better portfolio management techniques, um, and how that ultimately lead to different players perhaps entering the farming arena, and how that might change. I want to go into a couple of other papers you have. One of them are pesticides risk decreasing, the relevance of pesticide indicator choice in empirical analysis. You say the reduction of adverse health and environmental effects from pesticide use is currently a top priority on the agricultural policy agenda. Efficient pesticide policies must take into account farmers' application behavior, especially effects of pesticides use on economic risk. However, previous results regarding the direction of risk effects of pesticides are ambiguous. Um, and so what are you finding? So this is sort of the status quo policies around pesticides. You're finding those policies are not necessarily unambiguously beneficial.
Well, so I guess the starting point is that in particular in European agriculture systems, we are currently urgently trying to reduce pesticide risk for both human health and the environment. So there's a big debate about that. All European countries have established so-called national action plans to reduce pesticide risks. And thus there is a strong political will and commitment to reduce pesticide risk. And also, on the other hand, there is quite some societal debate about that. So that means there's also an opportunity for, let's say, the industry to sell products that are characterized by a lower pesticide use and thus lower risk for the environment and human health. So what I'm trying to say, this is quite a movement towards lower pesticide use or even pesticide-free production systems wherever this is possible. And now comes the point. I mean, ultimately, you can talk about many alternative kind of cropping system technologies, but farmers have to make use of it. And if they don't use it, then, well, there's little gain of having alternative solutions around. And in this particular paper, we wanted to address a key element, namely, farmers are not only applying pesticides to avoid crop losses and with that avoid, on average, the reduction of profits, but it's also kind of like an insurance-like mechanism, right? You can, by applying pesticides, you may also simply reduce the probability to fall below critical thresholds in terms of your production levels and your profits.
Yeah.
And even though it's very straightforward to say that, let's say, a more risk-averse farmer would apply more pesticides, it's not so clear from the literature, because that was ambiguous in terms of that very mixed results were actually shown. And here in that paper, we made use of an kind of like a data set for Swiss wheat production, where we really could zoom in details of pesticide use over several hundred farms and many years. And we could zoom in not only let's say, the expenditures on pesticide and the quantity of pesticides that they use, but also the toxicity. And what we find is that that pesticides, in terms of quantity, are risk increasing in our example, but in terms of toxicity, are risk decreasing. So to frame it differently, a farmer that is more risk averse is using fewer pesticides. Yeah. This is what we see in the data, but is using more toxic products. So, and this is a kind of the switch that is really important. That there is a switch in products, and farmers that are more concerned about risks may use products that are more toxic, but in that way may also be more effective in controlling specific pests. But ultimately, the quantity of their production is reducing, and this is I guess an important element also to consider, that quantity of pesticides is not at all a very good indicator for their possible environmental and human health effects. So this is a key element here. We have to really see what measure of pesticides we are focusing on.
So there is quantity, there is toxicity, and there is cost also, I would imagine, right? So all those three components sort of play into the decision-making process.
Yeah, that's true. And in particular, we are possibly, even if the farmer is not necessarily aware about the toxicity differences, but this is something to really have in mind that, if we do see that specific farmers, because of their high risk aversion, for example, are making use of very toxic products, then of course this is not necessarily an intended outcome, because this might increase substantially the risk for the environment and human health. So this also offers some policy entry points. So could you provide these farmers with other means to reduce their exposure to risk, and kind of like with that take away some of the incentives to switch to very toxic pesticides? Could there be other technologies provided to farmers that allow them to make pest management decisions in a more sustainable way to avoid that? So these are the type of implications that we want to derive from studies like that.
Are more toxic products less costly, Robert, on a per unit basis?
I guess that depends. It should be because that's a good question, whether to make that so. But I would assume that more effective products, at least, that might be also more toxic, are more expensive per unit basis. But it's not so clear cut. But there are some countries in Europe that try to make this difference, to break that difference a bit up. So, for example, in Denmark, there's a tax on pesticides that is the level of the tax is very product specific, and this is based on the toxicity of the product. So if a product is highly toxic and highly risky for human health and the environment, then the price of that pesticide product is substantially higher than, for example, for a product that is not risky at all for human beings and the environment. So here you can actually steer with the price of pesticides, also the application behavior of farms.
Yeah. I guess, so you can sort of tax it in some way, tax toxicity, so they fully sort of internalize the cost of toxicity, and perhaps you get good behavior. I was wondering, do the farmers face some sort of a switching cost issue? So they've been using X, and that is highly toxic, for them to switch to Y that is not that toxic. They incur a sort of an investment to do that, or that's not the case?
But it's really very specific to the type of crop, to the type of pest, whether this is a weed, an insect, a fungi pressure that we talk about. So I guess there are some opportunities where you can switch from more to less toxic products. For example, if you can make use of products that are also used in organic agriculture. So these are usually, they are not necessarily always without any impact for human health and the environment. Like, for example, copper is something that is frequently used, but it's not, let's say, not a sustainable product. But overall, there are potentials to kind of like substitute to better
Yeah.
products. But very often, to make the big steps, you may really need like a bigger change, for example, in terms of technology. So one specific example is this, we talked about it earlier, precision farming application, where you basically use sensors to spot in a field where specific inputs are needed and where not. So for example, to spot where you need to apply fertilizer or you need to apply pesticides. If you have a situation that is kind of like enabling you to make really targeted decisions in the field, you can spare a lot of the pesticides to be used. And this can be like a very effective way in reducing pesticide exposure also to humans and the environment. But this comes with, of course, with high costs. So here, this transition, the switch will be costly. And also this, of course, is again another policy entry point, how to enable farmers to make these technology choices that might be more kind of like socially desirable. But not necessarily this always has to be kind of like hardware that you apply and buy new machinery, but it also can be different cropping systems. For example, if you have crop rotations that are bigger in terms of having more diversity over time and space, this is also something that might reduce the pest pressure, and with that also reduce the cost for the need for pesticide application. But this might come with some opportunity costs, so that you not always have the highest profitable crop in every year, but you have to kind of like have a rotation that enables, that requires that you also take some crops that may not be perfectly profitable, but make sense in the long run because it actually reduces pest pressure, among others.
Yeah, that's, I was wondering. So from a societal perspective, if farmers are looking at pesticides sort of an insurance policy against a reduction in yield, there's sort of a policy societal question, which is there is a cost to pesticides, there is healthcare costs, there's environmental costs. And so, you know, if society can guarantee you know, some sort of a downside protection for the farmer, it's possible that we can substantially reduce the use of pesticides, right? I mean, it is really an insurance from a farmer's perspective.
Yeah, so definitely, I can just second what you said in terms of societal costs. So we have multiple entry points here. One is human health, where it's maybe not straightforward to have a causal relationship between the magnitude of pesticide use and the health outcomes. But we do know that pesticide use has negative effects on human health. So there are health costs, but there are also other costs, like for example, if water bodies are polluted, you might have to kind of like treat water to actually use it as drinking water. So there are also direct costs really end up in the pockets of us as consumers. But also if you think about, for example, loss of biodiversity because of pesticide use, this of course may also be very costly to, with other measures, to actually build up biodiversity again to the level that is intended, or kind of, I guess it's rather reducing the speed of biodiversity reduction. So this is in the end quite costly, and that actually calls for action by the government in terms of having a clear goal in reducing these risks. That means often also switching to less toxic products, switching to alternatives. I said that crop rotations technology, there might be different elements to be used and exploited further. And then is the question how to achieve that. I mean, having a goal is good, but then ultimately farmers have to be moved to new situations. And then we talked about taxes, which is one element, but probably not the only one. taxes might be used to raise money that also is used as subsidy for specific actions that farmers are doing. For example, new technology or a specific farming system that is less profitable but less reliant on pesticides. And also that element of giving them some kind of insurance-like mechanisms that they don't realize very low yield events because they reduce their pesticide use. This might be also a very interesting component. It's very difficult to achieve in practice because, well, these insurance solutions might come with two entry points. One is at the so-called intensive margin. So you do have a change in the pesticide use intensity in a specific crop. Let's say you have a vineyard and then there's an insurance provided to you that in the case you don't spray specific things, then you have a yield loss, then this is covered. And there might be a positive effect of such an insurance to really reduce pesticide use. But then you also have an extensive margin effect, and that is the spillover to land use. So providing such an insurance scheme may give farmers the incentive to expand their vineyard area. And overall, this might actually backfire, this effect, because then you have possibly a larger pesticide use in the end, because they may switch low intensity crops to areas to high intensity crops. And with that, even there is a reduction per unit basis in a particular crop. If that unit is expanded, then you might have more pesticide use in the end. So you see there's a kind of like a complex mechanism that might be in place if providing an insurance. But there are very good examples ongoing. So with a colleague in Denmark, we are now looking at the scheme that they have as a pilot there, where they allow farmers to basically skip some applications within the season, for example, for growth regulators. And in that situation, they can actually ask for an insurance. And this is, so what I'm trying to say, there are some pilots on the way where it's really very targeted to specific pesticides, to specific problems. So this can be helpful. But overall, I think important in that picture of demanding reductions in pesticide use also is requiring that somebody, and here the government can play a vital role, is providing information and incentives for farmers to use alternatives. I mean, otherwise just requesting reductions on one side, but not offering the opportunity, like the pathways how to actually achieve this. This is meaningless then. Yeah.
Do you see, Robert, there is a need for some sort of a EU-wide policy organization? Clearly what a country does has spillover effects to the entire continent, if not the entire world. And so country-specific policies are going to be suboptimum. So is there an EU-wide policy organization?
Yes, so the European Union actually has what is called a so-called common agriculture policy.
Yeah.
So they have a kind of like overarching agriculture policy, and this is this is the framework in which every country is operating in. Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but also has a agriculture policy that highlights specific elements, and what the European agriculture policies actually share is a clear focus not only on producing food, but also being sustainable. So in that sense, it's a clear target in these policies. And in the common agriculture policy of the European Union, recently, or at the level of the European Union, recently there was also a new vision, so to say, was formulated and among or under the umbrella of the green deal, so to say. There's a farm to fork plan formulated that really articulates particular environmental goals of farming systems to be reached in the next years. For example, cutting down greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, increasing the share of organic farming to 25%, and also reducing the risks of pesticide use by 50% in the next years till 2030. So in that sense, there is a bigger vision shared by many countries and the European Union, and also many countries that are not in the European Union. And indeed, this also calls for some coordination in terms of what instruments to be used. But of course, I mean, countries and farming systems in Europe are very diverse, and then one policy may be well suited to some systems, but not to others. And in particular, to give you the examples, you have a clear gradient between, let's say, arable production with cereals, where it might be easier to reduce the pesticide use and substitute, for example, towards mechanical strategies to control weed. But then you also have intensive, high value production of fruits, of wine. And in some regions of Europe, this is, of course, super relevant. And there, the intensity of pesticide use is usually much higher. So then it's difficult to find the one policy that suits all farmers.
Yes, as in conclusion, Robert, I know that you have done a lot of work in this area, continue to do so. If you look forward five years, where do you think two things? One is from a structural perspective. Where do you think farming will be, let's say 5 years into the future, in terms of size, in terms of how it's really managed, let's say. Another is about policy. So where do you think we will end up? I think there is increasing pressure from an environmental perspective to get better in farming. So do you have some speculations as to where you're likely to end up 5 years from now?
Very good question. Well, I mean, 5 years ahead, the farm structure won't be totally different than it is now. So there is some structural change in European agriculture, but again, this is very country specific. But this is not taking place at the pace where there's a complete change of the farming system within 5 years. So take the example of Switzerland. Maybe there's the loss of farms is at about 1% per year. So this is not massively then in terms also of like how farm size, for example, is changing. But we do observe in many European agricultural systems, we do see quite some transition, for example, because of the use of digital technologies that can massively change how farms operate. And so there's quite some change in the terms of technologies used, but also in terms of, I indicated that the goal formulated by the European Union to increase the share of organic farms to 25%, which is currently, I guess, only the case in maybe one or two countries like Austria, where this is really reached. But for many other countries, that would mean like a massive increase of organic farms. So this might be one element as well where this is heading, because it's desired by policy. And if there's also a market where farmers actually can benefit from higher prices, then of course that might be a viable area for farms to develop. And regarding policies, I mean, in Europe at large, I guess we see some developments. The first one is that you indicated that more environmental sustainability, so decreasing the footprints to the agriculture sector, both in Europe but also beyond, because European agriculture is a lot relying also on imports, for example, because of fodder imports for the animal production. So I guess this is something where there is a clear need and articulated demand to reduce that footprint environmentally, but also social sustainability will gain importance. So there are many food value chains that are not necessarily sustainable also from a social point of view. Again, questions about like imported food, but also food production and processing in Europe. And then this is the one thing, more sustainability. And the second thing is that we see increasingly a policy shift that goes from agriculture in its like a core and narrow sense and the level of the farm to something bigger. So what is talked about a lot, and we see that reflected in policy developments, is that we go from an agriculture policy to a food policy. So understanding that actually it's not the farm and the farmer that actually are kind of, so to say, the only entry point for policies to improve the outcomes of the food system, but there are multiple entry points. And in particular, I mean, it's very important to highlight it's our food system that causes environmental damages. That means that there are also other entry points, whether these are in reducing food losses, food waste, or in kind of like having a more sustainable mechanism to trade, having more kind of like sustainable ways of producing and marketing food. So this is something that is fascinating to see, that we move into like a bigger picture and will move away from the level of the farm to actually steer what agriculture is doing, but really have a more holistic approach towards what is then called a common food policy that Europe might be heading to in the next years.
Yeah, and it's I would imagine it's intricately connected with healthcare as well. So we look at the entire value chain. Food has a significant effect on health. And so from a policy perspective, as you say, we can't really look bottom up. You really have to look at the entire system.
Yes, and this is really changing also the way how you maybe look at specific interventions in that sector. So you have multiple outcomes, and human health is one, not only from a pollution point of view, but also from a point of view how you consume. And obviously providing kind of affordable, healthy diets and enabling kind of like a radical shift in the diets that might also be needed to have better health outcomes. This is something that you might steer. And also, I mean, there are often some kind of contradictions in specific policies. So sometimes you heavily support sugar production, but in the end, you tax sugar at the level of the consumer. So, and you see there are some elements that really might be not perfectly coherent in the moment, and there's a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit stuff where you can actually, I guess, easily create better outcomes. So I see that as a big opportunity, and also as a big opportunity to not transfer all the societal demands that we have to the level of the single farmer, but there are also multiple other entry points that can contribute to better and more sustainable food systems.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Robert. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yes, thank you very much, Jill. It was a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.